Good evening. Good evening. We're grateful that you're here with us tonight, and we appreciate you taking a few minutes of your evening to share some time thinking about an important conversation. As you know, right now in our world, there are important conversations around the issues of race and racial reconciliation, racial unity, happening in churches around the world, on the streets, and in business places and homes. It seems like everywhere you go, the conversation is there, and it's an important conversation to have. And so we've been having that conversation off and on for the last several years, and I'm excited today to invite a former professor of mine and friend of mine, Dr. Doug Foster, to be a part of a conversation that we're going to have tonight. And I have titled this Race and the Church, and there might be a better title that could be applied, but kind of try to keep that general enough that we can kind of go in various directions that we may want to go. But Doug, why don't you just introduce yourself briefly for those who may not know you, tell a little bit about your background, and maybe share a few minutes of just kind of your journey as a 60-something-year-old white male as you've been on this journey toward racial healing in our churches and in our world.
Sure. Thank you very much, Doug. I really appreciate you taking the initiative to have this conversation with your congregation, with people that you love and that you work with, and Christians who want to do what's God's will. So thanks so much for having this conversation. Yeah, I was born in North Alabama in 1952. And so grew up in a context that was thoroughly segregated at that time, and continued to be for most of my early life, for all of my early life, and even for all practical purposes beyond that, well into my third, fourth decade of life. The things that I have done, I went to school at a school that was run by members of Churches of Christ, the Mars Hill Bible School in Florence, Alabama. So we had Bible class every day, chapel every day, memorized lots of scripture in the King James Version. Mm-hmm. So that's always where it comes to my mind first, in the King James Version. It's such beautiful language. Went to school at Lipscomb University in Nashville, did some mission work in Mexico and in northern Spain. My desire, I think, was to be of use to the church, especially. I wasn't necessarily seeing myself as a preacher, but I was a teacher. I loved to teach and to help people understand scripture and understand things that I was growing and understanding myself. And so ended up, after Lipscomb, going to get a degree in theology, started a Harding grad in Memphis and finished at Scarrett College in Nashville, and did a PhD in church history at Vanderbilt University, and began teaching at Lipscomb. Taught there for about 7 years, and then was asked to come to Abilene Christian in 1991. The focus of my work at Vanderbilt was on, I guess you'd say, what we would call the Restoration Movement. We'll talk maybe a little bit more about that in a minute, but focusing on ideas of Christian unity at the time when our movement was actually dividing. And so how were people who were trying to hold it together doing that? How were they trying to talk about how we must stay together, even if we don't agree on everything. So teaching at ACU, I came in contact really with some powerful mentors. One of those was Jerry Taylor, mm-hmm. who is the director now of the Spain Center for Race Studies and Spiritual Action at ACU, has been a minister, preacher, teacher for many, many years. And Jerry, I think, was a sort of a pivotal person in my life. I grew up in a context that was totally segregated, and that was never questioned. Mm. Now, I, with my sister and brother and my grandmother, we could go to the Black congregation in the town next to mine. I grew up in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Sheffield was the little town right next to it, and there were sections in both of the towns that were white sections and black sections. And I could go when Marshall Keeble, who was at that time a famous black preacher, would come to preach a gospel meeting at the Black church in Sheffield. But when we had a gospel meeting at my congregation, there were not going to be any black people there.
Yeah.
And, it seemed, I guess at some level, even as a child, a little bit strange, but it never questioned it. No one ever questioned it. So the formation that I received as I began to look at this, as I began to study this, as I began to have actual real relationships, Christians of African American descent, and who were clearly experiencing a lot of things that I never had experienced. And as I became closer and was able to have conversations at a very deep and intimate level, began to understand some things, began to do a lot of research myself, 30 years ago, and began to really delve into what this is, what this means for the church, how it's in many ways has been and continues to be detrimental to what Christ would have his church be and what the kingdom should be on earth, and try to get ways where we as Christians who really care about being what God would have us to be can work in this and change this.
That's good. That's really good. So thank you for sharing that. So just so those of you who are watching know, I know Dr. Foster mostly in the context of his time at ACU, teaching there. He was I took church history classes with him and learned a lot under his mentorship as well, and the time that I spent in his classes and in various settings with him. Most recently, he and I both attended a racial unity leadership prayer retreat in El Paso back in December of last year, where we were going there to grieve and to pray and to gather in memory of the victims who lost their lives in the Walmart shooting. And so I spent several days with Dr. Foster and his wife and a couple of, 20 or so others, maybe just spending time listening to each other and to stories and to the Lord. And it was a really meaningful thing. So I want to say as we get started, that the conversations that are happening in our country are important. And I was asking before we started the recording, I was asking Doug about he's been having these conversations for years, but I was asking him if he's had them more recently, and he said he certainly had. And I think that's a good thing that people are talking about it. And I know even though they're talking about it, it still can be a difficult conversation. So I want to just say as we start, just invite you to if you're watching, just to prepare your heart, to kind of be aware of your posture, and let's be sure we're having a posture of humility, a posture of that suggests that we're willing to have a desire to listen and to learn. And there's some things I think that will be shared today that will help us do that as we continue to grow in Christ. And as you said, Doug, just to work, to not contribute to any of the detrimental things that have taken place, in our history. So I've specifically, some of the questions and things we're going to talk about, as you heard Doug say, has a PhD in church history, taught that for many years. And so I want to start there. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about church history and race and how those things kind of coincide and or interact quite a bit, obviously. And so I want to start with this. Most people watching will be aware of our movement in Churches of Christ and the movement that we're a part of, the Restoration movement. Just for those who might be watching that may not be aware of that, will you talk just briefly about what we mean when we say Restoration movement, and then we'll kind of talk some specifics about our movement.
Sure. Yeah, the term Restoration movement is a little bit tricky, I guess, because in church history, there are a number of Christian movements that refer to themselves or could be called restoration movements. The idea behind it is that something that has been lost or misused, set aside, forgotten, needs to be restored to its rightful place in the belief and practice of the church. And so throughout church history, there have been quite a number of groups that would see themselves as restoration movements. And certainly the one that we are part of in Churches of Christ is one of those movements, and begins early in the 1800s in the American context, U.S. context, with two major movements, Barton W. Stone in Kentucky, and Thomas, the father, and Alexander, the son, Campbell. Alexander Campbell would become sort of the chief leader eventually, but these two movements, one in Western Pennsylvania, Western Virginia, one in Kentucky, began to spread out. And they both really had as one of their major goals to bring about Christian unity, because there was such division, such, I guess you'd say, feuding and denouncing one another. And the church was really suffering. They became deeply convinced that the church was suffering, was not able to do what it could do and should do because of the divisions. And so that those two movements came together in the 1830s, roughly. Mm-hmm. We're very congregational, as you know,
right.
Churches of Christ, and they were that in those early days as well. And so it wasn't like some sort of merger, like a corporate merger. It was in every town, every village, every city where those churches who wanted to, not all did, but many of them did come together to form this movement that Churches of Christ are part of, as well as two other groups. Unfortunately, the unity movement itself divided later.
Right.
And so we have the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, as well as Christian churches, sometimes called independent Christian churches. So we've got those today, but that movement came together. And so that's the reason, in one sense, it's more accurate, if you're talking historically, to call it the Stone Campbell movement, or maybe the Stone Campbell Restoration movement.
Right.
But, a deep commitment to Scripture, a deep commitment to knowing what God would have us to do, and to trying our best to be that, a deep commitment to Christian unity. Although, one of the problems that we have, especially with the Campbell part of the movement, and I think we inherited a good chunk of that, mm-hmm. was that the emphasis was put, although Alexander Campbell knew better. I mean, he knew what was really the bottom line, the transformation into the image of Christ, but he put so much emphasis on getting things intellectually correct, getting things, doctrinal propositions, articulated very precisely. And some people, and sometimes he even seemed like he believed it, came to believe that was the bottom line. If we can if we can say the doctrine's right, and we can say, I believe those, I assent to those, that's what makes us a true Christian. And Campbell, of course, would, if someone pushed him on that, would say, no, what makes us a Christian is being transformed into the image of Christ. Barton Stone was much more open about those kinds of things. They're not weak on doctrine.
Right.
Don't misunderstand. They're not weak on, it doesn't make any difference. But they saw doctrine as a means, as something, as we struggle with the great truths of Christianity, for example, the atonement or the resurrection, the Lord's Supper, all those things, both beliefs and practices. Those are things that transform us spiritually more into the image of Christ. But I think that what happened with a lot of people was, the bottom line was the certification that you were a true Christian or a good Christian was you could say all the right doctrines, and you could jump on anybody who didn't say it exactly that way, rather than, as Campbell would say, it is the image of Christ in the other that you look for, that the Christian looks for, and not conforming to any one commandment, even as important as those commandments are. Those are the things that I think were at the heart of our movement, sometimes get kind of forgotten. But that's kind of the essence of the Stone Campbell Restoration movement. Like I said, Churches of Christ come out of that. There were, after the Civil War in the U.S., there was a division that took place between, it wasn't simply sectional, it wasn't simply North and South, although most of the Churches of Christ ended up being in what had been the South, the old Confederate states. But there were a lot of those Churches of Christ who were in the North too, and vice versa, disciples, Christian churches in the Midwest and North, although lots in the South too. But it had to do with a sort of a trajectory, the way that we're so influenced by our culture, I think a lot of times we're not fully aware of.
Yeah.
And especially with many in Churches of Christ, a very focused view of getting the doctrines stated correctly as the bottom line, and in some ways a very sectional attitude. Sometimes it's more rural, urban. I mean, it gets complicated.
For sure.
As you know, Doug, I teach a class 3 hours a week for 15 weeks,
Yeah.
answering that question, restoration movement.
And people wouldn't have even noticed this, but because I'm a former student of yours, I do notice that I would have gotten one of the questions wrong because I referred to it as the Restoration Movement instead of the Stone Campbell Restoration Movement. So,
well, but that's okay. That's okay. That's insiders have always used that terminology, especially in the early century when Churches of Christ were talking about historians or others in Churches of Christ. We've used that terminology a lot, and if you know what it means, then that's okay. But in the larger world, there's so many to be nice.
Yeah, that's good. So I want to. We have an outline that we're kind of working through, but I want to come back to the next question. And you mentioned the Civil War, so I want to talk about that, and then we'll come back to the other one. Elaborate a bit more, if you would. Maybe talk a bit more about how the Civil War impacted Churches of Christ, and even how the divide. You kind of referenced a little bit of the divide between the North and the South. Impacted Christians living in those areas. Start there, and then I may have a follow-up question as well. But
yeah, that's it is very interesting, and it is has a lot of layers to it. But I can say 2 or 3 things I think that might be relevant to our conversation today. One of the things that happened, and this has a long back history, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about it in a few minutes. The institution of slavery in the United States was backed by a certain understanding of the nature of Black people.
mm-hmm.
Okay, so again, it's a long backstory. It goes back to the 14 and 1500s with some of the European countries, but we can talk about that later. And so when slavery is abolished and the former enslaved persons are now free and are there and are able to at least they're no longer enslaved by those who held them as bond servants, as property, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
But the influence of the ideology of Black inferiority to whites at every level was very strongly part of the churches, and it's not just in the South.
Right.
It's across the board. But after the Civil War and until some of the major migrations would take place later, most of those former enslaved persons are in the South. I mean, that's where slavery existed. Mm-hmm. And in many cases before the Civil War, Blacks had worshiped with whites. In fact, they always worshiped with whites. Now, they were not equals.
Right.
They were relegated to the back of the auditorium or in the balcony if there was a balcony, and they certainly were not involved in any leadership role. But, and the fact of the matter is, part of the pretext for Blacks and whites worshiping together is that whites did not want Blacks meeting together without whites present. Huh. It was considered to be a dangerous thing.
Yeah, I can see that.
But after the Civil War and after the time of Reconstruction especially, there was just a total separation between Black and white Christians. Blacks formed their own congregations. There were a few Black congregations, even in the Stone Campbell Restoration movement before the Civil War, but not very many, just a handful. Edward Robinson, who's a dear friend and a scholar of Black history, has written several articles about some of that kind of situation. But for the most part, Blacks and whites at least had that kind of contact as Christians, But after the Civil War, we didn't. There was almost no connection whatsoever at a meaningful level. That is a level of Christian fellowship, even in segregated buildings, even in a situation where they were not allowed to be part of the leadership and not allowed to sit anywhere in the building. There had at least been some kind of shared worship experience, and that was over. Mm-hmm. And so there was almost a total separation, psychologically, certainly economically, educationally, housing. You can just go down the line, healthcare. Mm-hmm. that took place after the Civil War, and that was reflected in our churches. There was a big controversy in the Nashville Churches of Christ in the early 20th century, I think it was around maybe as early as 1903, where a white couple at a white congregation in Nashville had, according to some sources, they had adopted a young black girl. I've talked to some of the people who were actually descendants of that girl, and they said, well, it wasn't exactly, maybe legally adopted, but it was more like she was a servant. But they brought her to church with them, and some of the other white members objected and said, she should not be in here with us. And David Lipscomb writes a series of articles, actually, where he just rips into those people who were objecting. He said anybody that would object to the most humble child of God, coming in and worshiping and partaking of the elements, Lipscomb almost says they can't be Christians.
Wow.
But even in his language, he always sees the blacks as, they're humble, they're ignorant, they are easily emotionally swayed. All of the stereotypes, they're oversexed, which is one of the big ones that really cause lots of friction between blacks and whites. If you look at the history of how and all of that was in the church too. Mm-hmm. All of that was part of the conversations that are going on in the church. If you look at the larger context of what's the discussions are going on in America, these are conversations that are taking place. But what's so astounding? Well, it's really not astounding, I guess, in one sense. Everything that you see going on as far as those conversations and as far as the separation, the segregation, it's all in the church, and it's all upheld by the church. And again, this is not simply in the South, it's also around the whole country as time goes on, especially as migration takes place. The segregationist systems that existed in the South are in many ways recreated. It's not exactly the same, but the same kinds of separation and subordination of the black race takes place. And so the Civil War, after the Civil War, it basically results, one of the things it results in is the separation of black and white Christians, the almost total separation, except in a relationship. When there is a relationship, it's a relationship of what's the right word I'm looking for? I'm thinking of the word patron, mm-hmm. where the white church would maybe make sure that the black church had a little ramshackle building, and maybe give them worn out songbooks or Bibles that the whites have worn out and give them to the black church, but to make sure that they would not be coming over to the white church. Huh. The Civil War is a complex thing. There's lots and lots of effects of the Civil War on American society, including the churches. But to me, that's one of the most tragic things. And you might say, well, it couldn't have happened any other way in the circumstances. Well, as a historian, I have to say, well, it didn't happen any other way. Yeah. That's just the way it happened. But as a Christian, I keep thinking it could have. Mm-hmm. It could.
So let me ask you this then. This is going a little off script, but how do you explain, how do you make sense of how a movement that starts with, and I realize we're talking about, a specific stream of Christianity, right? So this is not just an issue that was going on in Restoration Movement churches and Churches of Christ, whatever. This was happening in every tribe. So, but how do you make sense in our movement of how, a movement that starts with a focus on Scripture, which, today you and I read and we think, man, if people are just continuing to return to the words of Jesus, if they're continuing to read, the Old and New Testaments both, that they would come to the conclusion about some of the things in their life that didn't add up, right? I mean, that's the way I think about it today. And so, a movement that starts with a focus on Scripture, a focus on unity, and even, you mentioned like this intellectual correctness, and that one I can maybe dismiss a little bit, because it's, you can, as you and I both know, we can be doctrinally, or think that we're doctrinally correct on everything, and still our life not add up necessarily to what we're teaching. But the first two, I think, especially like a focus on Scripture and a movement that was focused on unity. How do you make sense of how it got to the place that it did, where even with slavery being abolished, that there still wasn't a lot of movement in churches in regard to pursuing that? Does that make sense? That question make sense?
I think it does. And I think that the answer to that goes back to something I started talking a little bit about earlier. And this is a long, and I wouldn't say complex, it's pretty easy to document as far as when things happen and as ideas get formed and as they get passed on and put into a specific context. But we were part of the American buying into,
Mm-hmm.
and again, I don't want to just say, well, Americans invented this and Americans are the worst everywhere about this. That's not true. But we, as white Americans, were fully buying into and accepting, really uncritically, I think, in some ways, although there was plenty of evidence that people could point to, quote, evidence that people could point to the inferiority of Black people. And so at several levels, things are going on. Number one, if Black blood, so to speak, that is what makes you a live person,
Mm-hmm.
is somehow inferior, then you certainly don't want that mixing with white blood, right?
Right.
So you've got to have separation, not just separation. I mean, social separation. You don't want to have any kind of context where those things could happen that would pollute, and that's the terminology that would be used in lots of laws that were passed in states all around the nation. They're called anti-miscegenation laws. Miscegenation means intermarriage,
Right.
but it's a bad word. I mean, it's a bad word because it says, the word itself means that it's mixing stuff to the pollution of something that's pure.
Right.
And so you have this deep sense of what's right and what's good, and it's white. White is the standard. White is the superior, and anything that would denigrate or pollute or take away from that has to be stopped, has to be avoided at all costs. There were people who, especially before the Civil War, but it continued on for some, in some cases, and even today, oddly enough, it's kind of resurfaced with some of this scientific racism that sometimes comes out. But some people, there were several theories that were trying to say, why is it that Black people are inferior? The theories never said, or the question was never raised, are Black people inferior?
Right.
Are white people
the question, it was assumed before the question was asked that there were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the different theories were one that actually I was surprised when I first learned about it, was that there were actually more than one creation.
Wow.
That white people were created. The story that you read in the Bible
Yeah.
of Adam and Eve and God in the Garden of Eden and all that, that's white people. Black people were created in a separate creation. It's called polygenesis, which is, to us, it sounds just, kind of ridiculous, but that was one of the ways that people were trying to say. Another theory was the curse of Ham.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I heard that one.
The after Noah and his sons
Mm-hmm.
survived the flood and their families and began to repopulate the earth and so forth. And it was Ham was the son who saw his father drunk and naked, and the others covered him. But anyway, the story goes that was the curse, that the descendants of that part of the family would be servants of the rest of the people, which also begins to tie blackness or color with inherent slavery. In other words, if you're black, you deserve to be a slave. You are a slave. God's made you a slave. It's okay for us to enslave you. Again, I don't think any of us as Christians who believe that God has created all people of the same blood would buy that. But there were, the thing about it, all of these theories are being promoted by people who claim to follow Christ.
Right. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's such an important conversation to have and to be aware of our history, because I feel like that when it's the water that you're swimming in, I know we've all had the thought of, man, if I lived in, or my generation, you did live in the civil rights era, but like my generation, if I lived in the civil rights era, I hope I would be a person that would stand up and speak out and do it, right? But at whatever point in history you're living in, it's the water that you're swimming in, and there takes a level of maturity maybe, or ability to be reflective, to think critically, that kind of thing, to like kind of rise above the fray, so to speak, and like go, I'm gonna think differently about this. Where do I start? How do I do that? So along those lines, how for you, again, this is not a question that I plan to ask you, but I'm curious, just how do you have like moments or a couple of moments in your journey that you remember, like things beginning to shift in your thinking, or some significant kind of some turning points, where you thought, I've got to do some reevaluation on this, or I've got to start thinking about this in more critical ways, or things like that? Do you have some stories that come to mind, or a moment that comes to mind?
Well, it's a really good question, Doug, and I've reflected on that more than once, I guess, in the last few decades. I guess I'd have to say it this way. I know that there are some people who, it's kind of like they got a whack on the side of the head. God just sort of said, okay, listen to me finally, and sort of some dramatic experience, some turning point, some crisis. God has worked pretty gently on me.
Yeah, that's good.
I don't, there have been some crises in the sense of being deeply impressed at how bad I've messed up,
Mm-hmm.
of how wrong I had been thinking, and I think that those crises have made me, I hope they've made me less arrogant than I perhaps have been in the past, and more humble and more aware of my own shortcomings. But I think that this for me has been really and truly maybe now going on a 40-year journey, which you talked about the fact that a lot of folks are talking about this today, and a lot of white people, perhaps who had not talked about it or thought about it in the same way, are beginning to, and to thinking about it in ways that they maybe had not thought about it before, or not been willing to think about before, or didn't think they needed to. for because of some of these events, and then because of checking into maybe some of the historical stuff and becoming more informed, are really beginning to see, wow, this is bigger than I thought. This is much more serious than I thought. And I think that for me, that has happened over a long period of time. I mean, like I said, my relationship with Jerry Taylor has really been transformative. He asked me to go with him once to confront a leadership group, a large white congregation that had, there were some things that they had said that nobody thought were being heard, apparently, that were very derogatory of Black people and of Jerry particularly. And he wanted me to go with him. And I took to sit and to watch his gentle way of confronting.
Mm-hmm.
It was confrontation. It was not, avoiding things, but to do it in a way that was not filled with hate, but filled with a sense of, this can't be according to Christ. This isn't, and I don't want to be trite, but it was not what Jesus would do. It's not something that would be characteristic of those who really are trying to be Christ-like and reflect the image of Christ in all their life. And so I think that told me several things. One thing it told me was, this has been several years ago, I still got some of those ideas in my head.
Right.
I grew up in North Alabama. Okay. I'm hearing all the jokes.
Right.
I'm hearing all of the statements that even by good Christian people, my mother, my dad, my grandparents, who loved me and I loved them and still do. And yet they, because of the context in which they had been socialized or shaped in the ways that they viewed the world and the ways they understood things, I mean, just little throwaway phrases that I'm not even going to say.
Right.
But about Black people.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it could be reinforced by experience, because the lack of access to good education, the lack of access to good jobs, the lack of access to adequate housing and health care had put them in a situation where, there was a segment of the old Eyes on the Prize video that was done a number of years ago on the history of the civil rights movement by PBS, the very first series. In the first film of the first series, they were interviewing a Black man and a white woman in Birmingham, Alabama. And both of them said the same thing.
Wow.
They said, we just thought this was the way it was supposed to be. Nobody told us it was wrong or out of the ordinary, and I remember the Black man saying, I just thought this was the way God had intended it to be. Mm-hmm. And without any sense of the fact that this has a history, that there are specific things that happen that have made that situation exist. And I think that in the back of my head, I still had all of those wrong, sinful, evil stereotypes that sometimes I was even unaware of.
Yes. And
yet they would pop up just out of nowhere sometimes. And it's true that even people who at the conscious level are committed anti-racists, because of the I don't know, we could use computer technology, I guess, because of the program, the programming, the operating system, I guess, that's still running, that stuff is there. It's still there. And it takes, I really don't think it can ever be changed without spiritual power, spiritual transformation.
Oh, that's good. And I think we're going to talk some more about that, I think, in a second, just the need for the spiritual power of transformation to be at work in us so that there can be genuine, sincere heart and mind change. So, okay. So for those of you that are watching, we're gonna do this in two parts because there's a lot of good things to talk about, and I want you to be able to digest it all. So I'm going to ask one more question, kind of a history question, and then we're gonna wrap up for this week, and then Part 2 of this conversation will be available next week, and so hopefully that'll give you something to look forward to. And we wanted to have it in small enough kind of bite-sized chunks here that you could think about what's been talked about over the last 30 minutes or so, 40 minutes or so, and then be able to have some time and space to think about that, reflect on that, and then come back next week for another conversation that'll be connected to this one. So kind of the last question I'll ask for part 1 here, in thinking about unity, our movement, what are some examples that you think of? You referenced Lipscomb, actually. I think it was Lipscomb that made some statements, but still kind of, would, in his language, would kind of show his hand, so to speak. What are some examples that you think of? Are there examples you think of in our movements past that we can look to as we try to make our way moving forward?
Some positive examples, maybe.
Or are we are we only, maybe the answer is we just need to learn from them and maybe do it a different way too. I don't know. That's certainly a possibility.
Yeah. I would say 2 or 3 things. Number one, there were people, white Christians in our churches who, like Lipscomb, really believed that it was wrong to refuse fellowship with, to separate or segregate the churches, to have black churches, white churches, and so forth. But even those people, when you begin to look at their overall statements, their overall understandings are still, and please don't misunderstand me. When I use the word white supremacist, I'm not talking about crazy skinhead neo-Nazi people. I'm using that term simply as white people who believe that white civilization, white people are superior. Okay.
Right.
And so you see that sort of naturally there. And again, you don't have to, what's the word I'm trying to look for? You don't have to ignore the sin in a person's life.
Right.
Does not necessarily at all mean that you're saying that person is just totally evil.
Right.
I mean, David Lipscomb was a great leader in many, many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And he opposed the kind of overt discrimination toward black people that, especially in the churches, was being practiced by the churches in his and across the country, really. And yet he still was very much in that mindset. And so I would say there's not a whole lot to help us in this. Okay, let's just do like what David Lipscomb did, or let's say what someone else might have said. I would say, again, that the most common relationship between black and white Christians in churches of Christ in the 20th century has been that relationship of sort of patron, if there's a relationship at all. And so, for example, white churches would hire a black preacher like Marshall Keeble, some of the others, to come into a town and to preach the gospel, and they would have a gospel meeting, and the whites would go. Certainly they would be separated from the blacks. The whites would come and listen because they liked to listen to Marshall Keeble. He was a very engaging and entertaining speaker. I've got 2 phonograph records of some of his preaching, and he is an engaging preacher, and he was, for the times, very much in line with what churches of Christ would have believed about, we've got this all right, we've got everything right, and you have to be this. But part of, again, the pretext was that they wanted to make sure that, as the white church wanted to make sure that the blacks had their own church, so that they would not be coming over and worshiping with them. And some people would say, well, that was just the custom. In fact, most cities in the 20th century had laws against, most southern cities especially, but across the country, had laws against, the Jim Crow laws they're called, blacks and whites coming together in any sort of way that it would even imply equality, social equality in any form fashion at all. I would say that in recent years, there has been an effort, and I've got a list of a number of churches of Christ in different parts of the country, north and south, east and west, who have really made an effort to become multiracial churches.
Mm-hmm.
They're not a huge number, and multiracial churches, sociologists basically define that as being at least 20% of the congregation's members are something other than the majority. So you have to have at least 20% other than, if it's a multiracial congregation, other than white,
okay.
if it's the majority, or other than black, or other than Asian or Hispanic, or whatever it might be. There has to be that kind of diversity. And another piece of it is that a truly multiracial congregation is going to have a multiracial leadership structure.
Yeah.
In the pulpit, and the eldership, and the deacons, however the congregation is led. And so those are some models that I think that are there that we can begin to draw from, but that becomes a little complex too. And this is a hard topic. It's a hard topic, but too often when we talk about becoming diverse congregations, what we mean is that those people can come over here into our space, and they can be like us, sing our songs, do things the way we do them, and they'll be fine, and we'll welcome them. And there are a lot of, I know particularly because I have a number of African American deep friends, longtime friends, who would say that we are not honored as who we really are when we go into those contexts, and the kinds of things that they experience day after day after day out in the marketplace, in the job, at school, wherever, that white people are just unaware of. And I've had people come to me and say, well, I've got black friends. These are white people. Obviously, they come and say, well, I've got black friends, and they don't ever say anything about this. They seem like they're doing fine. And I say, well, here's the deal. If you can talk to them at a level where they'll really, really open up, I think you might find out differently. But if they have a cordial relationship with a white person, they're just not going to jeopardize that. Mm-hmm. By beginning to tell some of their experiences. And what usually happens is that the white person tries to explain it away.
Yeah.
In other words, they don't take it for face value. They don't recognize and respect that experience. They begin to explain it away. And I think that's a problem with just simply saying the solution to everything is just having black people or Hispanics or whatever it might be to come over here and be part of us. It might be, there was a book that was written a number of years ago called Divided by Faith that talked about white churches and black churches in America primarily. Divided by Faith is the name of the book, and it tells stories about that very thing happening, and black people becoming so frustrated because they wanted to be together, mm-hmm. but the assumptions were that you're going to come over and be like us. And nobody, the authors who did the surveys, they did hundreds and hundreds of surveys across the United States, said that in not one single case did a white person consider going to an African American predominant church. Now, there may be cases where people did.
Sure.
But it was always the white people saying, you come over and be with us.
That's an important thing to consider. I appreciate you sharing that. So okay, so we're going to keep the conversation going. There's obviously a lot to, this was a typical thing, we would have maybe some questions and interaction a little bit. So I realize there's a lot to process. So we're going to wrap up. This is going to be part one, and I want to encourage you to come back for part two. which will be next week. And we'll keep the conversation going. We've talked a lot about history, and we're going to continue to talk about and reference some of the history as we keep the conversation moving forward, but also look toward some steps that we can take and how we can live into a new future. And so appreciate you being here with us tonight, and I hope you'll come back next Wednesday for more of this conversation.